Hey everyone, I made a short regarding the forgotten archetypes, or at least the types of characters that have basically been forgotten by the meta, or at least forgotten by HoYo in terms of buffing potential, but I honestly think it's a pretty big issue for a lot of people. If you're somebody who mains Sealy, IL, Blade, or perhaps you like these characters and got them to max investment points, whether that be, hey, you maxed out their relics, or you got their signatures, or you decided to get Eidolons on them, it doesn't matter. What I mean is, these are still characters you usually and used to enjoy, and maybe you still do like them. But I think it's become very difficult to play who you just like. If you're somebody who strictly enjoys DOT or DOT, you're gonna face issues with the current meta because the current meta does not like DOT in the slightest. If you're somebody who maybe likes characters such as Jing Yuan, or even somebody like Jing Liu, they don't really have a solid place. Don't get me wrong, they are good units, but contrary to I think something like Genshin or ZZ, you can't learn some way to get around what is being placed within MOC. You have to basically brute force it because you're not necessarily dealing with complex rotations or dealing with the concept of an elemental system. You're basically either A, matching weaknesses, which used to be unique and until everybody decided they're going to implant their own weakness, or just ignore it, in which case that kind of falls through entirely, and characters like W lose value because yes, the implant is still there, but the characters who want an implant to break weaknesses just do it automatically. I'm not necessarily saying it's a bad thing because it allows them to be more flexible, but I am saying everybody just kind of gets it now, even if it's not break reliance, and it's kind of confusing at this point. But that's a whole different archetype, a whole different point. I think that HSR has the most endgame content. If we are strictly looking through the game's roster, you have MOC, Pure Fiction, and Apocalyptic Shadow. You also have a Divergent Universe, but that's a whole different story. I think the downside of this is that contrary to something like ZZZ, as an example, because it's the newest HoYo game, these aren't mechanics that are super duper easy to activate and just generally beneficial. This is dependent on you weakness breaking the enemy. And so this really does incentivize break teams. If this is a situation to where it boosted either A, break damage, or B, break efficiency, it would benefit, I think, a lot more people universally. But you could generally just avoid this in the same way ZZZ is doing now, which is, hey, if you have a shield, you get a buff. If you dodge, you get a buff. Or the Genshin method of, if you do a normal attack, you do X true damage. It's a very simplistic thing. I think that it allows more flexibility within those games compared to this. Now, this isn't necessarily the only issue, but I do feel like these three game modes are basically the same. Pure Fiction is wave oriented, so yes, you would obviously see more value in AoE clearers. Great. However, Pure Fiction also still has bosses, and the problem with these bosses or these singular enemies is unless you kill them, or these elite mobs basically, if you don't kill them, you will run into a situation to where the smaller mobs aren't spawning in because you haven't finished this wave, technically speaking. Apocalyptic Shadow could have been more single target oriented, but it's basically just MOC towards the last stages. And so it's not. Your biggest issue with basically all the HoYo games is you're not timed based on damage. You're not basically judged on how much damage you do or how long you survive. You're judged based on did you clear a number of time, in X amount of time, or in this case, X amount of waves or turns. And so this means that you're not necessarily incentivized to play better or play because HSR really, you can't play better. I think that the other games allow a lot more flexibility and expression within the playstyles you have options for. You can do either Soldier Weapons Burning Team, you can mix and match elemental archetypes within either of the two HoYo games. In this one, you can't. Elements don't matter as much because yes, you do have characters like, I think IO, for example, who gets a bonus if the enemy is imaginary weak. You get somebody like Sealy, who gets a bonus based on just quantum weakness, both in the set and in her own kit. I think that's fine, but I believe that obviously in most games, in every HoYo game at least, supports do really reign supreme, and that's fine. I think supports are super duper flexible. I like they're flexible. That's fine. But when you start overloading DPSs, you get to a point where your DPSs aren't all viable and it's pick who you want and build around them. It's, no, this character is extremely good and so far better than the previous characters. Jing Liu does not compare to Acheron. Firefly isn't going to compare to anyone else on the roster with what she does. And I understand she's technically a new break archetype, but comparing her, like, okay, Jing Yuan isn't going to match up to anyone. Blade has been forgotten simply because who uses Blade? And it's not necessarily saying Blade is a bad unit. It's saying that because it's HP scaling, he either A, has HP buffs or B, damage percentage buffs. Follow-up attack buffs could be nice, but that would be Jing Yuan. That would be characters like Jade, and characters like Jade do more, and Jing Yuan technically has a summon, which is Lightning Lord, so he's an entirely different archetype that really hasn't been focused on. And so it sucks because you're pushed out of the meta arbitrarily. Dot teams, I obviously don't use my dot teams because I don't like the characters themselves, but dot teams, they're just not going to perform well. Dot is a much more turn order based, it's turn dependent. We've gone out of the situation to where you're waiting on the enemy's turn and you get benefits from it to a situation to where can you kill them turn 1? What about turn 2? And you're done. Or if you're looking at a Firefly team with break, can you break them turn 1 and just stop them from ever moving again, which is the situation with characters like Ron May as an example. HSR has a meta, and I like the meta of this game. I'm obviously a Genshin player, or at least I used to play Genshin. I've experienced the game without a meta. I just think the downside is HSR, contrary to Genshin, forces you to abide by the meta, because in 1 or 2 patches, if you aren't, you will get left behind. The Acheron team that you're seeing here isn't good because for Acheron, it's good because it works because each of the units are very flexible. The problem with Break is that it is so inherently expensive to run, and that with your DPSs, they aren't going to fit within the current archetypes because current content either A, wants boss killers, B, weakness breakers, C, an opponent who will take so many actions. Hule is still awful to fight unless you can counter him or break his weakness. Your 4-stars either A, don't exist anymore, or B, are not comparable to a 5-star. I'm not saying they need to be comparable. What I am saying is we don't have 4-star alternatives for a lot of the 5-stars right now. Lynx at least was comparable as a healer with cleanse, with emergency heals in particular, and that was quite nice. And she also offered unique targeting priority, but we don't see that anymore. I think it's fine to have this meta, and I think a lot of individuals don't mind it. If you pull for the newest characters, you're in a great position. But if you like older characters and you want to hyper invest into them, you kind of have to accept that eventually they're going to be left behind, unless it's a support like Sparkle, unless it's a character like Robin. Unless it's a Harmony unit, they are basically going to be left out of the way in a pretty long period of time. Yes, they have longevity, but not nearly as much as everybody else. Harmony units are very flexible, but preservation? Fushuan at least has 1 buff with her E1, and that's kind of it. Everything else is just meh. Silverwolf is nice, but she's single target, and with the content we have now, AoE is king. And so AoE versions of Silverwolf, somebody who can implant either a area-wide quantum weakness, or somebody who can implant more Death Down, is going to be superior. Older characters don't really have that much longevity, and in this game, we don't get 4-stars that are really good. Unfortunately, I don't mind Harmony Trailblazer. I think they're actually quite nice. But what I do dislike is the fact that we haven't gotten a good 4-star that you would want to use. I'm not saying they have to offer a unique archetype. I'm having to say they're not even comparable to the 5-stars on hand fulfilling a niche. It's like, hey, maybe you want to run Break, but you don't have Ron May, or you don't have Lingxia, or anyone else. No. Or maybe you want to run somebody like Robin, but you need a different buffer. No, we got Yukong as the closest thing, and Yukong is so dependent on Eidolons that she's basically bad without it. And that was ages ago. How many of you actually built Misha? How many of you built Moza? I don't know what his name is. How many of you legitimately built Gallagher? Gallagher was at least good, but that's because he was strictly for one team that only has one alternative, and that is Lingxia now. Pella is incomparable to what Ron May offers, because Pella is generic Death Down. Ron May is way better for just Break. I think HSR is fun, don't get me wrong, but I think its endgame mode just boiled down to the exact same 3 archetypes, and it's not fun if you don't have those archetypes. I think we have a wide roster of characters, but for the 3 endgame modes, it's not a situation like Imaginarium Theater where you may alternate between a variety of characters. It's situations where you're only really going to have 8 characters. And for a lot of these teams, there is no replacement. Have you tried a second Firefly Break team? You can't. There is no secondary unit to Break team. Your ideal Firefly team is Firefly, followed by Ron May, Harmony Trailblazer, and then Lingxia. There is no secondary unit to replace those in the event that you want to run 2 Break teams. DOT is just gone because not only are we not getting any good or new DOT units, why would you use them in the current meta that wants boss killers, that wants AoE killers? It just feels bad, especially if you like older units. And I know some of you do. I do too. But tell me your thoughts down below. I could be wrong. Either way, subscribe and I'll see you next time.